Who's the most unexpected enemy you've ever had? I work for one of the bougiest daycares in California. It was supposed to be modern, and all the staff went out of their way for the kids. We even forced our manager to make a rule that none of us were allowed our phones during work, so that the babies wouldn't grow up to be iPad kids. For the first few months after opening, everything went smoothly. Until one day, when one of the 5-year-olds started slurring their words and stumbling around the room like a drunkard. We figured it was just some weird sugar rush and sent her home. But the next week, it happened with 2 more kids. Then 3. The complaints came flooding in, and honestly, the parents had every right to be furious. One mom's voice cracked when she told me her son had been acting strange for days. But then things got darker. My supervisor insisted on calling CPS on 3 of the families, claiming the parents must be leaving substances within reach at home. I watched a father break down in our parking lot after a social worker showed up at his job. These parents were being investigated for something we all knew deep down was connected to our daycare. The thing that killed me was watching my coworkers' faces during our emergency staff meeting. Elena, who'd been teaching for 15 years, looked like she might cry. Mitch kept rubbing his temples, muttering about how he'd personally inspected every toy twice that week. Our manager tried defending us to the parents, insisting our products were clean, that we followed every safety protocol. But I could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. The health department showed up, went through everything. But everything was clean, and the incidents kept happening. Kids went from feeling nauseous to vomiting. When police finally showed up, our manager did something I'll never forget. She convinced them to investigate the parents' homes first, buying us time. Then she cornered me and Jenny in her office. "Figure this out," she hissed, "or I'll make sure you two take the fall. I'll blacklist you from every daycare in the state." Jenny's hands were shaking when we left her office, and we went into overdrive, testing absolutely everything. We started wondering if it was the new carpet in the reading nook, maybe off-gassing chemicals. We paid to have it tested. Nothing. Jenny and I became obsessed, staying late every night trying to solve this. Was it the hand soap? We switched brands 3 times. The air vents? We had them professionally cleaned. I even started suspecting the paint on the walls might have lead, even though the building was only 2 years old. Then our manager pulled me and Jenny aside with this exhausted look. She was giving everyone else mandatory PTO for a week. Everyone except us. "I need to know," she whispered, and I realized she was testing if someone on staff was behind this. It felt awful being the only 2 she trusted, but I got it. The worst part? With just me and Jenny running the entire daycare, the incidents actually got worse. 3 kids in 2 days. One had to go to the ER because their heart rate spiked. That's when we knew for certain this wasn't an inside job. My coworker started a spreadsheet tracking everything: which rooms the kids had been in, what they ate, who they played with, even what songs we'd sung that day. Nothing made sense. The only consistent thing was that it happened in the afternoon, and the symptoms: dizziness, slurred speech, sometimes nausea. Parents were pulling kids out daily now. We went from 60 enrolled to 23 in 3 weeks. Then one night, Jenny and I were going through our tracking sheets for the 100th time, sitting on those tiny plastic chairs at 11 p.m. My eyes were burning from staring at lists when Jenny suddenly grabbed my arm. "Wait, look at this." She'd highlighted every incident. Every single one of them was in the art room that day. My heart started pounding. We practically sprinted down the hallway, flipping on lights. The paints looked normal. Markers. Fine. Then I opened the Play-Doh cabinet. The containers looked exactly like always. Bright colors, properly labeled. But when I opened the blue one, there was this faint chemical smell that made my nose tingle. It was wrong. My hands were shaking as I opened another container. Same smell. The next morning, we had the Play-Doh tested. Positive for traces of sedatives. Someone was spiking our Play-Doh. But here's what made me want to scream. I knew every person who worked here. I'd seen Tom spend his own money on better art supplies. I'd watched Maria come in on her day off when a kid was having separation anxiety. These weren't just good people. They were people who dedicated their lives to children. We were a day away from shutting down when one of our delivery drivers mentioned something weird. He'd seen someone from Happy Tots, the daycare across town, near our delivery entrance 3 times in the past month. Our security footage showed the same woman, always wearing a Happy Tots polo, always there right before our Play-Doh deliveries. The detective's face changed when we showed him. Turns out Happy Tots had been losing clients since we opened. The woman in the footage was their assistant director. When they arrested her, she said we deserved it. I was about to show her what she deserved too. 2 officers grabbed my arms before I could move, and my whole body was shaking with anger so bad I could barely stand. The woman from Happy Tots wouldn't even look at me as they put her in the back of the patrol car, and that made me even more mad because she didn't get to just look away after what she did to those kids. Jenny grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight, and I could feel her shaking too. Detective Garrison walked over with her notebook out and asked if we could talk right here in the parking lot. And I nodded because I wanted to tell her everything while it was still fresh. She asked me to walk through how we found the Play-Doh, what it smelled like, when we realized someone from outside was doing this. I told her about the delivery driver mentioning the Happy Tots woman, about going through the security footage 3 times to make sure, about how we tested every single container and they all came back positive for sedatives. Jenny added details I forgot, like how the chemical smell made her nose burn when she opened the red container. Detective Garrison wrote everything down and told us we did good work, that most people would have given up way before we did. Then she said we needed to come to the station to give full statements, and my stomach dropped because I was so tired I could barely think straight, but I knew we had to do it. We spent the rest of that night at the police station in this small room with bad lighting and uncomfortable chairs. Detective Garrison brought us coffee that tasted like dirt, but I drank it anyway because I needed to stay awake. She had us go through everything again, but this time way more detailed, asking about exact times and dates and who else was around when things happened. Jenny had her spreadsheet on her phone, thank God, because my brain was so fried I couldn't remember if the first incident was on a Tuesday or Wednesday. We talked for hours about every kid who got sick, every symptom we saw, every test we ran on the building and supplies. Detective Garrison explained that the woman from Happy Tots would be in court tomorrow morning for something called arraignment, where they'd officially charge her with child endangerment and criminal poisoning. She said the charges were serious, that the woman could go to prison for years because she poisoned kids on purpose. I asked if our manager could get in trouble too for waiting so long to really investigate, and Detective Garrison's face got tight. She said probably not in criminal court, but maybe in civil court if parents decided to sue. That answer made me feel sick because it meant our manager might just walk away from this like she didn't do anything wrong. I barely slept that night, lying in bed staring at my ceiling while my brain wouldn't shut up. Part of me felt relief that we finally caught her, that we could prove it wasn't the parents or something wrong with our building or our staff. But the other part of me was so angry I wanted to scream, thinking about all those kids who got sick because some woman decided business competition was more important than children's safety. I kept seeing their faces, the way they stumbled around confused, the way their parents looked at us with so much fear and anger. When I finally fell asleep around 4 a.m, I dreamed about the little girl who had to go to the emergency room. In the dream, her heart was beating so fast I could see it through her chest, and I was trying to help her, but my hands wouldn't work right. I woke up sweating and couldn't fall back asleep, so I just lay there waiting for my alarm to go off. The next morning, our manager called an emergency staff meeting before we opened. Everyone was back from mandatory PTO, and you could feel how tense the room was as soon as people started walking in. Elena looked like she hadn't slept either, and Mitch kept checking his phone like he was hoping for an excuse to leave. Our manager stood at the front of the room and explained that the police arrested someone from Happy Tots for tampering with our Play-Doh, that this person had been sneaking into our delivery area and poisoning the containers before they got to us. She made it sound like we'd solved everything super fast, like we'd been on top of it the whole time. But she never mentioned how long the incidents went on, never said anything about how she made us keep operating while kids were getting sick, never brought up the 3 families she made us call CPS on. I watched people's faces as she talked, and I could tell some of them were doing the math in their heads, figuring out that something didn't add up in her version of events. Elena started crying right there in the middle of the meeting and everyone turned to look at her. She said she'd been thinking for weeks that she did something wrong in her classroom, that maybe she wasn't watching the kids close enough, or wasn't cleaning the toys right. Her voice was shaking when she said she barely slept because she kept going over everything she did each day, trying to figure out what she messed up. Then Mitch stood up and his face was red and angry, and he said he just realized something. He said the manager knew something was seriously wrong but kept us open anyway, kept us working with kids while they were getting poisoned. Our manager tried to interrupt him, but Mitch kept talking, saying how messed up it was that she threatened me and Jenny instead of shutting down and figuring it out. Other teachers started nodding and I could see our manager's face getting tight with anger. She said we needed to focus on moving forward, not pointing fingers. But her voice had this edge to it that made it clear she was mad that people were questioning her. After the meeting, our manager pulled me and Jenny into her office and shut the door hard enough that it made us both jump. She said thank you for solving the problem, but her voice was cold and businesslike, not grateful at all. Then she leaned forward and told us we needed to be very careful about what we said to parents and media, that this was a sensitive situation, and we couldn't afford to make it worse. I asked what she meant by careful, and she stared at me for a long second before saying that talking about internal processes or response times could hurt the daycare's reputation and make parents lose trust. Jenny's hands were shaking in her lap, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was, that this was a threat dressed up as advice. Our manager said she was counting on us to be team players, to remember that we all wanted what was best for the facility. But what she really meant was that we better keep our mouths shut about how long she let this go on, about how she called CPS on innocent families, about how she threatened to blacklist us. I nodded and said okay, but inside I was so angry I could barely see straight. Christopher Hooper showed up right at opening time and I saw him through the front window before he even got to the door. His face was red and his jaw was tight and I knew this was going to be bad. He walked straight to the front desk and asked to speak with management and his voice was shaking with barely controlled anger. Our manager came out of her office trying to smile, but Christopher wasn't having it. He said he wanted to know why CPS showed up at his house and his job, why his family got investigated when the daycare knew there was a problem here the whole time. His voice got louder as he talked, saying his son still has nightmares about social workers taking him away, that his wife cried for days thinking they were going to lose their kid. I stood there watching, and I didn't blame him one bit for being mad. Our manager tried to put her hand on his arm in this fake, comforting way, but he pulled back like she'd burned him. 3 other parents were standing behind him, and they were all nodding along with everything he said. One mom had tears running down her face, and another dad's hands were in fists at his sides. Our manager went into this corporate speak mode, talking about following protocols and ensuring child safety and how we had to investigate all possibilities. But Christopher cut her off and said that was garbage, that any reasonable person would have known to test the daycare supplies before calling CPS on families. He said his lawyer would be contacting us, that his family went through hell because the daycare was more worried about covering its butt than protecting kids. The other parents started talking too, all of them saying similar things about how their families got blamed and investigated while the real problem was right here. Our manager's face went pale and she tried to say something about insurance and proper procedures, but Christopher was already walking toward the door. He turned back and said he hoped we all could sleep at night knowing what we put families through, and then he left with the other parents following him. The front area went completely quiet after they walked out, and I could hear my heart beating in my ears. Jenny looked at me with wide eyes, and I knew we were both thinking that this was just the beginning of parents being mad at us. That afternoon, Ava Landry came to pick up her daughter, and she pulled me aside in the hallway away from other people. She said thank you for finding the truth, that she knew Jenny and I worked hard to figure out what was happening. But then her voice got quiet and sad, and she said she couldn't trust this place anymore. Her daughter was the one who went to the emergency room with her heart racing, and Ava said she still has nightmares about that night. She said even though we caught the person who did it, she keeps thinking about how long it took, about how many times her daughter played with that poisoned Play-Doh before we tested it. I tried to say something about how we tested everything else first, about how hard it was to figure out, but she just shook her head. She said she was withdrawing her daughter effective immediately, that she'd already enrolled her somewhere else. I watched her walk down the hallway to get her daughter's stuff from her cubby, and I felt like someone punched me in the stomach. We did everything right in the end, but it still wasn't enough for some families. By the end of the week, we lost 8 more families despite catching the saboteur. Each time a parent came to withdraw their kid, they said basically the same thing. They weren't just mad about the poisoning itself, they were mad about how long it took for the daycare to take their concerns seriously. One dad said he told us 3 times that his son was acting weird after daycare, but we kept saying it must be something at home. Another mom said she felt like the daycare cared more about its reputation than about figuring out why kids were getting sick. A few parents said they might have stayed if our manager had been honest about the timeline and apologized for how long it took, but instead she was acting like we were heroes who solved everything fast. I had to smile and be professional while they said all this stuff, but inside I agreed with every word. We went from 23 kids enrolled to 15 in just 5 days, and I knew more families were probably going to leave once word got around about how we handled everything. 2 days after the last family walked out, my phone rang during nap time and I saw Detective Garrison's name on the screen. I stepped into the hallway to take the call, and my stomach dropped when she told me the saboteur posted bail that morning. She said there was a restraining order in place keeping the woman at least 500 feet from our facility, but hearing she was out walking around made my hands shake. I kept picturing her face in that courtroom, the way she wouldn't look at any of us, and now she was just out there somewhere. Detective Garrison must have heard something in my voice because she spent 5 minutes reassuring me that the restraining order was serious, and any violation would put her right back in jail. But I still felt sick when I hung up. Jenny was in the break room eating lunch when I found her and told her the news, and she put down her sandwich like she'd lost her appetite too. We were sitting there trying to process it when the front door opened and this guy in a gray suit walked in carrying a briefcase and a clipboard. Our manager came out of her office to greet him, and I watched all the color drain from her face when he showed her his credentials and said his name was Cooper Stewart from the State Licensing Board. He said this was an unannounced inspection following multiple complaints about our facility's handling of the poisoning incidents, and our manager's smile looked like it was made of plastic. She tried to act calm and professional, saying of course we'd cooperate fully, but her voice had this tight quality that told me she was panicking inside. Cooper spent the next 3 hours going through absolutely everything. He sat in our manager's office reviewing every single incident report from the past 2 months, every parent complaint we'd documented, every communication log. He was polite the whole time, never raising his voice or acting aggressive, but there was this methodical quality to how he worked that made it clear he was building a case. I had to bring him copies of our safety protocols and training documents, and I watched him make notes in the margins with this focused expression. When he interviewed me about the timeline, he asked really specific questions about when parents first reported symptoms and what our response was. I told him the truth about how we tested everything else first, about the 3 weeks it took us to figure out the Play-Doh was the problem, and he just nodded and wrote more notes. Our manager kept trying to sit in on the interviews, but Cooper said he needed to speak with staff privately, which made her even more tense. Later that afternoon, Cooper called our manager back into her office, and I could hear her voice through the door trying to control the narrative. She kept emphasizing how quickly we acted once we had solid evidence, how we immediately contacted police and had the contaminated Play-Doh tested. But then Cooper's voice cut through, quieter but somehow more powerful. pointing out that parents had been reporting symptoms for 3 full weeks before we tested the Play-Doh. He said the timeline showed a pattern of dismissing parent concerns and prioritizing the facility's reputation over investigating potential safety issues. His tone wasn't angry, but it was absolutely clear he found our response timeline deeply problematic, and I heard our manager's voice get defensive, trying to explain all the other things we tested first. When Cooper finally left around 5 p.m., our manager locked herself in her office and didn't come out. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Jenny saying she was worried about losing her job. She said our manager had been cold to both of us ever since the arrest, barely making eye contact and certainly not thanking us for solving the case anymore. Jenny thought the manager blamed us for the licensing investigation. Like if we just kept quiet about everything, then none of this scrutiny would be happening. I texted back that we did the right thing, but my hands were shaking as I typed it because I was worried about the exact same thing. That night, I couldn't sleep again, lying in bed staring at my ceiling, thinking about how twisted this all was. We figured out what was poisoning the kids. We caught the person responsible. We probably saved children from getting hurt worse, and somehow it felt like we were being punished for it. Our manager had protected the business first and the kids second, letting incidents continue for weeks while she tried to avoid bad publicity, and now she was acting like Jenny and I were the problem for making it all public. I kept thinking about those families who got investigated by CPS, about the little girl in the ER, about all the parents who pulled their kids out because they couldn't trust us anymore, and I wondered if our manager lost any sleep over her choices. The next week, I was helping set up the art room when I heard voices at the front entrance. I walked out to find this guy with a camera and a press badge talking to our manager, saying his name was Ronan Felix from the local news station, and he wanted to interview staff about the poisoning case. Our manager's face went hard and she told him absolutely not. We had no comment and he needed to leave the property immediately. Ronan tried to say the public had a right to know what happened at a facility caring for their children, but our manager just kept repeating that he needed to leave. After he left, she sent out an email to all staff threatening disciplinary action up to and including termination if anyone spoke to reporters about the case. The email said we needed to protect the children's privacy and the facility's reputation, but it felt more like she was trying to protect herself. 2 days later, I got a call from a woman named Haley Cochran, who said she was an attorney representing 5 families affected by the poisoning. She'd gotten my name from one of the parents and wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify about the timeline of events and management's response. My heart started pounding because I knew this was exactly what our manager had been afraid of, exactly why she'd been so cold to me and Jenny lately. Haley said the families were considering a civil lawsuit against the daycare, and my testimony about what really happened could be crucial to their case. I told her I needed to think about it, and she said that was fine, but she hoped I'd consider helping these families get the truth on record. After work that day, Jenny and I met Haley at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the daycare. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back and this serious but kind expression. She explained that the families weren't just suing over the poisoning itself, but over the daycare's response that let it continue for weeks after parents started reporting symptoms. She said our testimony would be crucial to proving the facility knew there was a serious problem, but chose to prioritize reputation over safety. Haley showed us copies of the incident reports and parent complaints, pointing out how our manager had documented concerns, but then did nothing substantive about them for almost a month. She said if Jenny and I testified about what really happened, about the manager's threats and delays and attempts to blame parents instead of investigating the facility, it would show a pattern of negligence that went beyond just the saboteur's actions. Jenny asked what would happen to us if we testified, and Haley was honest that it could make our work situation very difficult. But she also said the families deserved to have the truth come out. That night, I lay in bed torn between my conscience telling me to help these families get justice, and my fear that testifying would end my career in childcare. Our manager's threat about blacklisting me kept playing in my head, her voice saying she'd make sure I never worked at another daycare in the state. But then I thought about Christopher Hooper's face when he talked about the CPS investigation, about Ava Landry saying she still had nightmares about her daughter's ER visit, about all those parents we'd failed by not acting faster. I didn't know if I was brave enough to risk everything I'd worked for, but I also didn't know if I could live with myself if I stayed silent and let our manager get away with what she'd done. The next morning, I walked into work feeling like my stomach was full of rocks. Our manager's door was closed when I arrived, but around 10 she called me into her office alone. She smiled when I sat down, this friendly expression that didn't reach her eyes, and asked if I'd been talking to any lawyers. Her voice was casual, like she was asking about my weekend plans, but I could see her watching my face closely. I lied and said no, and my hands started shaking, so I shoved them under my thighs where she couldn't see. She leaned back in her chair and told me that loyal employees would be rewarded when this all blew over, and the way she said it made it crystal clear what happened to disloyal ones. I nodded and got out of there as fast as I could without looking suspicious. My phone buzzed during lunch with a text from Jenny saying she needed to talk after work. We met at the same coffee shop where we'd met Haley, and Jenny looked as stressed as I felt. She told me our manager had pulled her into the office that morning too, asked the exact same questions, used the same friendly, threatening tone. We sat there drinking cold coffee and trying to figure out what to do. Jenny kept coming back to those parents who got investigated by CPS, how their lives got turned upside down because our manager waited too long to take the poisoning seriously. 2 days later, Detective Garrison called my cell asking if I could come in for a follow-up interview about the criminal case. I took a sick day and met her at the police station, where she walked me through the timeline again. During our conversation, she mentioned that the prosecutor was building charges not just against the saboteur, but potentially against Happy Tots Daycare for failing to supervise their employee properly. I asked if our manager could face charges for the delayed response, and Detective Garrison said probably not criminally, but definitely in civil court. She leaned forward and told me off the record that she'd seen cases like this before, where management tried to make whistleblowers disappear, and I should be careful. The State Licensing Board report came out the following week. It cited our facility for inadequate response protocols and failure to put child safety first during the investigation. We weren't shut down, but we were on probation with monthly inspections required for the next year. Our manager called another emergency staff meeting and spent 20 minutes basically blaming me and Jenny for the licensing problems. She said we created panic instead of handling things quietly, that we made the facility look bad by pushing so hard. Elena actually stood up from her tiny chair and said that was completely unfair, that we'd saved kids by figuring out what was wrong. 2 other teachers nodded in agreement but didn't say anything out loud. After the meeting, I got an email from Haley saying I was scheduled to give a deposition for the civil case next Wednesday. I hadn't told our manager yet, and the thought of that conversation made me want to throw up. Jenny texted me that night saying she'd decided to testify too, and we were both scared about what happened after. That weekend, I drove to my parents' house and finally told them everything that had been happening. My mom listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me what I would tell a child in my care to do if they saw something wrong. I sat there on their couch and realized I already knew the answer. Monday morning, I walked into our manager's office before the kids arrived and told her I'd been subpoenaed for the civil case. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. It wasn't technically true yet, but Haley said she could make it official if I needed legal protection. Our manager's face went cold and hard, all the fake friendliness from before completely gone. She told me we'd discuss my future here after the deposition, and the way she said future made it sound like I wouldn't have one. The deposition happened on Wednesday morning at Haley's law office downtown. I sat in a small conference room with gray walls and a long table that smelled like furniture polish. Haley was across from me, and the daycare's lawyer sat 2 chairs down with a stack of papers in front of him. The court reporter set up her little machine in the corner. Haley started with basic questions about my job duties and how long I'd worked there, getting me comfortable. Then she walked me through the timeline, asking about each incident with the kids, when we first noticed the symptoms, what our manager said in meetings. I answered everything as clearly as I could, trying to remember exact dates and times. The daycare's lawyer jumped in after about an hour, asking if I was sure about what our manager said in her office. He kept using phrases like allegedly threatened and your interpretation of events, trying to make it sound like I was exaggerating or making things up. My hands started sweating under the table. But then Haley pulled out printed copies of text messages between me and Jenny from those weeks, and I watched the daycare lawyer's face change as he read them. Jenny had texted me right after that meeting saying she was shaking, and our manager just threatened to blacklist us, and I'd responded saying I know I heard it too. The lawyer tried a few more questions about whether I felt personally targeted, but the text backed up everything I was saying. 4 hours later, my throat was dry and my back hurt from sitting in that uncomfortable chair, but I'd gotten through it. Haley walked me out and told me I did great, that my testimony was solid. Jenny's deposition was scheduled for the next day at the same office. We'd agreed to meet up after at a coffee shop 2 blocks away. I got there first and ordered us both drinks, sitting at a table by the window watching people walk past. When Jenny finally came through the door, her eyes were red and her makeup was smudged. She dropped into the chair across from me and just started crying, not even trying to hide it. I pushed her coffee toward her and waited. She told me the daycare's lawyer had been brutal, asking if she had any proof she was a reliable employee, bringing up a time she'd called in sick 3 days in 1 month, questioning whether her memory of events was accurate or if she was just following my lead. He'd made her feel like she was the one on trial instead of just giving testimony. She kept saying she was definitely getting fired after this, that there was no way the daycare would keep her on after she testified against them. I tried to tell her we did the right thing, but she just shook her head and said, "Doing the right thing doesn't pay rent." 2 days later, I was scrolling through news on my phone during my lunch break when I saw the headline. Happy Tots Daycare had released a statement through their lawyers claiming their former assistant director acted completely alone and they had no knowledge of her activities. The statement said they were shocked and saddened by her actions, that they'd always maintained the highest standards of professionalism, and we are cooperating fully with the investigation. I felt my jaw clench reading it. I called Detective Garrison from my car after work, and she sounded tired when she answered. She told me this was standard legal strategy, that companies always try to distance themselves from employee misconduct to avoid liability. But I told her their lack of supervision is what made the whole thing possible, and she agreed, but said proving corporate negligence was harder than proving individual guilt. The frustration in her voice matched what I was feeling. The saboteur's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. Jenny and I took the day off work and drove to the courthouse together, neither of us saying much in the car. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out. We sat in the back row. When they brought her in through the side door, she was wearing regular clothes, dark pants, and a blue sweater, and seeing her out of the orange jail uniform made my skin crawl. She looked so normal, like someone you'd pass in a grocery store and never think twice about. She sat next to her lawyer at the defense table and kept her eyes down, never once looking back at where we were sitting. I kept staring at the back of her head, thinking about all those kids who got sick because of her. Her lawyer stood up when the judge asked how they were pleading. He argued for reduced charges, saying his client had been dealing with a mental health crisis and never intended to cause serious harm to anyone. He talked about her previously clean record and her years of service in childcare, painting her as someone who'd made a terrible mistake during a difficult time. I felt Jenny grab my arm, but then the prosecutor stood up with a folder full of documents. She showed the judge photos from the ER visit. The little girl hooked up to monitors with her parents standing beside the bed looking terrified. She presented medical reports detailing the sedative levels found in the Play-Doh samples, explaining how dangerous those concentrations were for small children. She walked through each incident, each child who got sick, each family that got investigated by CPS because of false suspicions. The judge listened to everything, looking at the photos, reading the reports. When the prosecutor finished, the judge denied the motion for reduced charges without hesitation. The saboteur would face the full child endangerment and criminal poisoning charges. Outside the courthouse after, Jenny and I stood on the steps trying to process what we'd just witnessed. Christopher Hooper came walking over from where he'd been standing with a few other parents. He looked older than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes. He thanked me for testifying in the civil depositions, said it meant a lot that someone from inside the daycare was willing to tell the truth. Then his voice got quiet, and he told me his family was still dealing with trauma from the CPS investigation. Social workers had shown up at his house, questioned him and his wife separately, searched their home, talked to their son. He said his son still has nightmares about being taken away, wakes up crying asking if the police are coming. I stood there listening and felt something break open inside me, this wave of anger and sadness that I'd been pushing down for weeks. That evening I sat on my couch with my laptop, scrolling through job postings at other daycares in the area. I couldn't keep working at a place that had treated these families like collateral damage, that had let kids get poisoned for weeks while protecting its reputation. Each listing I clicked on made me think about what kind of management they had, whether they'd do the same thing in a crisis. I bookmarked 3 positions that looked promising, places with smaller enrollment and longer tenured staff. The idea of starting over somewhere new was scary, but staying felt impossible. My phone rang 2 days later while I was getting ready for work. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. I answered, and a man's voice said, "This was Ronan Felix from the local news station, asking if I had a few minutes to talk." My first instinct was to hang up, remembering our manager's threat about talking to media. But then I thought about Christopher's son having nightmares and Jenny crying in that coffee shop, and I was tired of letting fear control every decision I made. I told Ronan I'd talk to him on background without using my name. He said that worked fine. He just wanted to understand what happened from someone who was actually there. We talked for 30 minutes, me sitting on my bed describing the timeline, the manager's delays, the threats she'd made. He asked good questions, pushing me on specific details without being aggressive about it. His story ran 2 days later on the evening news and online. I watched it on my phone during my break, sitting in my car in the parking lot. The segment focused on how childcare facilities sometimes put reputation ahead of reporting safety concerns, using our situation as an example without naming me or Jenny specifically. But anyone who knew the case would know exactly who the sources were. That night, my phone rang at almost 10 p.m. Our manager's voice came through, shaking with rage the second I answered. She didn't even say hello, just launched into how I'd betrayed the facility and violated every trust she'd placed in me. She told me I was suspended pending an investigation into policy violations. I knew exactly what this was. Retaliation for talking to the press. Punishment for telling the truth. My hands were shaking, but I managed to open my laptop while she was still talking, pulling up the recording software I'd downloaded after Haley warned me to document everything. I hit record and let her keep going, her voice getting louder as she listed all the ways I'd supposedly violated protocols. When she finally finished and hung up, I saved the audio file and emailed it to Haley immediately with the subject line retaliation evidence. My phone rang less than an hour later. Jenny's name lit up the screen and my stomach dropped before I even answered. Her voice was shaking when she told me the manager called her too. Same accusations about policy violations, same suspension effective immediately. We were both technically still employed but banned from the building, and we both knew exactly what this was. The manager was pushing us out slowly, making it look official so she could avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. Jenny started crying on the phone, saying she couldn't afford to lose this job. She had student loans and rent and her car payment. I told her about the recording I sent to Haley and promised we'd fight this together, but my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone. We stayed on the call for almost an hour, neither of us wanting to hang up because being alone with this felt impossible. When we finally said goodnight, I sat on my bed staring at my laptop screen, refreshing my email every few minutes waiting for Haley to respond. She emailed back at midnight saying she'd file an emergency motion first thing in the morning, and this was clear retaliation that no judge would tolerate. I barely slept, checking my phone constantly for updates. Haley called me at 9 the next morning saying she'd filed the motion citing workplace retaliation against witnesses in active litigation. The hearing was scheduled for that afternoon because the judge took these situations seriously. I sat by my phone all day, too nervous to eat or do anything productive. At 4:30, Haley called back and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. The judge ordered the daycare to reinstate us immediately, or face sanctions for obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. Our manager had to personally call us back to work, and Haley said the judge made it very clear that any further retaliation would result in contempt charges. My phone rang 10 minutes later and the manager's voice was ice cold when she told me I was reinstated effective tomorrow morning. She didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge what she'd done, just gave me my schedule and hung up. Jenny got the same call, and when we talked that night, we were both relieved but terrified about actually going back. Returning to work the next morning was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. I walked through the front doors at 7 and the manager was standing in the hallway talking to another teacher. She saw me, turned around, and walked away without saying a word. The other teacher gave me this awkward smile and hurried off. I went to the break room to put my lunch in the fridge and 2 coworkers were in there. They both got quiet when I walked in, grabbed their stuff, and left. The whole morning felt like that. People avoiding eye contact, conversations stopping when I entered a room, everyone scared about their own jobs and not wanting to be associated with me. Jenny showed up at 8, and I watched the same thing happen to her. We ate lunch together in the break room, just the 2 of us, neither of us saying much because what was there to say. But then Elena came in during her break and sat down at our table. She looked at both of us and said what we did took real courage. She told us she'd been documenting her own concerns about management for months, keeping a journal of times when the manager prioritized the facility's reputation over addressing problems. She said if we ever needed a witness for anything else, she'd back us up without hesitation. I felt tears start to form because after a whole morning of people treating us like we had a disease, here was someone who understood why we did what we did. Elena squeezed my hand and went back to her classroom, and Jenny and I looked at each other with this tiny bit of hope that maybe we weren't completely alone in this. The next few weeks were tense at work, but things slowly started shifting. Haley called me one evening to say the civil case was moving toward settlement negotiations. The daycare's insurance company was pushing hard for them to settle because our depositions made their liability crystal clear. The families would get financial compensation, and the facility would have to implement new safety protocols and oversight procedures. She said the insurance company knew they'd lose at trial and wanted to avoid the publicity of a courtroom battle. I asked what that meant for the manager, and Haley said probably nothing criminal, but the settlement would likely require management changes. 2 days later, the manager called me into her office. She closed the door and pulled out a document, sliding it across her desk toward me. It was a non-disclosure agreement. She offered me a small raise, maybe $2 more per hour, if I signed agreeing never to discuss what happened here with anyone, including media, other childcare facilities, or licensing boards. I looked at that paper and thought about Christopher's son having nightmares, and those 3 families who got investigated by CPS for something that happened here. I pushed the document back across the desk and told her no. I watched her face change as she realized she finally couldn't control the situation anymore. She'd tried threats, tried suspension, tried money, and none of it worked. She told me I could leave her office, and her voice had this defeated quality I'd never heard before. The criminal case against the saboteur wrapped up about 6 weeks after our reinstatement. She took a plea deal rather than go to trial. The prosecutor's office called to tell me she pleaded guilty to 6 counts of child endangerment and criminal mischief. She got 2 years in prison and 5 years probation after her release. She'd also be banned from working with children ever again, and have to register as part of her probation conditions. I hung up the phone feeling this weird mix of relief and frustration. 2 years felt like nothing for what she did to those kids and families. But the prosecutor explained that proving intent for more serious charges would have been difficult, and this guaranteed conviction was better than risking acquittal at trial. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I decided to attend. Jenny came with me for support. We sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as the saboteur was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit. She looked smaller somehow, less threatening than she'd seemed in my mind. But then the parents started giving their victim impact statements, and I remembered exactly what she'd done. Christopher stood up and described how his son still flinches when anyone in authority speaks to him because he's terrified of being taken away again. Ava talked about the ER visit, and how her daughter wouldn't eat anything at daycare for months afterward, crying every morning at drop-off. Another mom described the CPS investigation, the social worker searching their home, her husband's co-workers finding out, and the rumors that spread. By the time the 4th parent finished speaking, half the courtroom was crying, including the judge. The saboteur kept her head down the whole time, never looking at any of them. When the judge announced the sentence, she added that this was one of the most disturbing cases of workplace sabotage she'd seen because the victims were innocent children. It felt like justice, but also not enough, because those kids still went through something terrible, and some of those families would carry this trauma forever. No prison sentence could fix that. The civil case settled 3 weeks after the sentencing. Haley called me at home one evening and said the final settlement had been approved. She couldn't tell me the exact amount because of confidentiality terms, but she said it was substantial and every family would receive compensation. More importantly, the settlement included mandatory policy changes at our facility, including new incident response protocols, regular third-party safety audits, and staff training on mandatory reporting requirements. I asked if the families seemed satisfied, and Haley said most of them were ready to move forward. Christopher told her directly that no amount of money fixed what his family went through, but at least the settlement would prevent this from happening to other kids. That meant something to him even if it didn't heal his son's nightmares. As part of the settlement terms, our facility had to bring in an outside consultant to completely overhaul our incident response protocols. The consultant showed up 2 weeks later, a woman in her 50s who'd spent 30 years in childcare licensing and safety oversight. She spent 3 days interviewing staff, reviewing our procedures, and observing our operations. On her last day, she met with our manager and the corporate leadership team. Elena told me later that she'd heard raised voices coming from that meeting. The consultant's first official recommendation came in a written report the following week. Management needs to change. She didn't say it politely or diplomatically. Her report documented multiple failures in leadership judgment, prioritization of reputation over child safety, and retaliation against staff who tried to address problems. She recommended immediate replacement of current facility management and a complete restructuring of reporting procedures. I read that report sitting in my car during lunch break and felt this surge of validation that almost knocked the breath out of me. 2 weeks after that report landed, our manager announced she was resigning. The email went out on a Tuesday morning with some corporate language about pursuing new opportunities, but everyone knew what it really meant. I watched through the window as she packed up her office that same day, stuffing framed certificates and motivational posters into cardboard boxes. She walked past me in the hallway on her way out and didn't say a single word, just kept her eyes straight ahead like I wasn't even there. Jenny texted me from the toddler room asking if the manager had said goodbye to me either, and when I said no, she sent back 3 angry face emojis. The interim manager showed up the following Monday, a woman in her 40s named Jana who'd been running facilities for 20 years. She called an all-staff meeting her first day and laid out the settlement requirements in plain language, no corporate speak or defensive posturing. After the meeting ended, she asked me and Jenny to stay behind. We sat in those tiny plastic chairs while she pulled up a regular-sized one and looked us both in the eye. She told us she'd read every document from the case, including our depositions and the consultant's report. Then she apologized for how the previous management had treated us, said it was wrong and shouldn't have happened. Jenny started crying right there, and I felt this weird mix of relief and anger because the apology felt good, but also reminded me how much we'd been through. Jana said she wanted us to know that things were going to be different now, that child safety would come before reputation every single time. The next week, she promoted Elena to lead teacher and brought her into the management team. Elena found me during afternoon snack time and said she was going to make sure this place actually put kids first from now on. I believed her because I'd watched her fight for children for 15 years, seen her stay late to comfort scared toddlers and spend her own money on classroom supplies. She had this determined look in her eyes that told me she meant every word. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail from Detective Garrison. She'd closed her investigation and wanted to thank me personally for my persistence in solving the case. Her note said most people would have given up when management pushed back, and my dedication probably prevented more children from being harmed. I read that letter 3 times sitting at my kitchen table, and each time it felt a little more real that what we did actually mattered. Jenny came over that weekend and told me she'd decided to leave childcare entirely. She'd been accepted to a nursing program starting in the fall, and said this whole experience showed her she wanted to help people in a field with clearer rules and better protection for people who speak up. I felt sad about losing her as a coworker, but also proud of her for choosing what was right for herself. After she left, I sat on my couch for hours trying to figure out what I wanted to do. Some days I loved working with the kids and felt like I was making a real difference in their lives. Other days I couldn't stop thinking about how the system had failed them, how the manager's threats had almost kept us from finding the truth. I'd wake up at night replaying those 3 weeks when kids were getting poisoned and we couldn't figure out why. The guilt over not solving it faster sat in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. 3 months after the settlement, Ava Landry called and asked if she could bring her daughter back for a tour of the facility. I met them at the front entrance on a Saturday morning, my hands shaking a little as I unlocked the door. Ava walked through every room, asking questions about our new protocols and safety measures. Her daughter held her hand the whole time, peeking into classrooms but staying quiet. At the end of the tour, Ava said she'd heard about all the changes we'd made and wanted to give us another chance. She said seeing the new management and safety systems made her feel like we'd actually learned from what happened. That vote of confidence meant everything to me, made me feel like maybe we could rebuild trust with the families we'd hurt. Christopher Hooper's family never came back, but he sent me a message through the facility's parent portal. He said he didn't blame me personally and hoped I'd continue fighting for kids. His son was doing better in therapy now, though he still had trouble trusting authority figures. Reading that message made my eyes burn with tears I didn't let fall until I got home. 6 months after the settlement, Cooper Stewart came back for another inspection. He spent the morning reviewing our incident logs and observing classroom procedures, then met with Jana in her office. When he left, Jana called me in and said we'd been removed from probation. Cooper had told her we were now a model for how facilities should respond to safety concerns. I felt this surge of pride mixed with frustration, because it took a crisis and near shutdown to get us here. That same week, I heard through the childcare network that Happy Tots had closed permanently. They'd lost most of their enrollment after the arrest became public, and several families had filed their own lawsuits. I felt this grim satisfaction knowing their business jealousy had destroyed them in the end. Not us. They'd tried to ruin innocent children's lives out of spite, and karma had caught up with them hard. The first few weeks after everything settled, I'd wake up around 3 a.m. and just lie there staring at my ceiling. I kept thinking about those 3 weeks when kids were getting poisoned and we couldn't figure out why. My brain would replay every moment, wondering if I'd checked the Play-Doh cabinet on day 5 instead of day 21. Could I have stopped more kids from getting hurt? The guilt sat heavy in my chest, even though everyone told me I did the right thing. I started sleeping through the night after about a month, though sometimes I'd still jolt awake thinking about that little girl who went to the ER. Some things you just carry with you forever, and I figured this was going to be one of them. Parents started calling again asking about enrollment openings around 2 months after the settlement. Word spread through the community about all the safety changes and the new management taking over. We went from 23 kids back up to 30 within a few weeks. By month 4, we hit 45 children enrolled and had a waiting list forming. Parents would tell me during drop-off that they felt confident leaving their kids here now because they knew we'd actually listen if something seemed wrong. One mom said she chose us specifically because of how we handled the crisis once we figured it out. That feedback meant everything to me after watching families flee in terror just months before. The interim manager called me into her office on a Tuesday morning about 5 months after she took over. She'd been made permanent director the week before, and I figured she wanted to discuss my schedule or something routine. Instead, she offered me the assistant director position with a significant raise and full authority over safety protocols. I sat there kind of stunned because I'd spent so long being threatened and pushed around by the previous manager. This felt like the system finally rewarding doing the right thing instead of punishing it. I accepted on the spot and started my new role the following Monday. Jenny drove up from her nursing program that weekend to celebrate my promotion. We met for coffee at the place near the daycare where we used to decompress after those terrible late nights investigating. She looked genuinely happy for me, not jealous or bitter about leaving the field. She told me watching me fight through everything inspired her to stand up for herself in other areas of her life. She said she'd spent years letting people push her around. Seeing me refuse to back down made her realize she could do the same. Her nursing program was going great, and she loved patient care way more than childcare. We stayed friends after that, texting regularly and meeting up whenever she came home. Elena and I started hanging out outside of work around the same time I got promoted. We'd grab dinner after shifts and talk about everything that happened. She told me one night over Thai food that she almost quit during the crisis. She'd been teaching for 15 years and had never seen anything like it. Watching me and Jenny fight to find the truth made her want to stay and help fix things instead of running away. We bonded over watching an institution fail and then helping rebuild it into something better. She became one of my closest friends, someone who understood exactly what we'd been through without me having to explain. I started reaching out to the affected families about 6 months after the settlement to update them on changes. I sent personal emails to each family explaining the new safety protocols, management changes, and oversight systems we'd put in place. Some parents responded warmly thanking me for the update and saying they appreciated knowing we'd made real changes. Others never responded at all, and I had to accept that some relationships were damaged beyond repair. Christopher's family sent a brief reply saying they were glad we'd improved but wouldn't be returning. Ava's family didn't respond to my first email, but she called me 3 weeks later. She wanted to bring her daughter back for a tour of the facility. We scheduled it for a Saturday morning when the building was quiet. I met them at the front entrance and walked them through every room. Ava asked detailed questions about our incident response procedures and how we'd changed our supply chain security. Her daughter held her hand the whole time, peeking into classrooms but staying quiet and cautious. At the end of the tour, Ava said she'd heard good things about the new management and wanted to give us another chance. She said seeing the safety systems and talking to me made her feel like we'd actually learned from what happened. Her trust meant everything to me, made me feel like maybe we really could rebuild what had been broken. Her daughter started back the following week and settled in well with the other kids. 6 months into my assistant director role, I led training sessions for all staff on the updated incident response procedures. I gathered everyone in the main classroom on a Saturday and went through each protocol step by step. I made sure everyone understood that protecting children means speaking up even when it's uncomfortable or risky. I shared parts of my own story as a teaching example, talking about how scared I was to keep investigating when the manager threatened me. I wanted them to know that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. The newer staff members looked shocked hearing about what happened, and the ones who'd been there during the crisis nodded along, remembering. I emphasized that we had systems now to protect staff who raised concerns, and that management would back them up instead of threatening them. Around that same time, I started volunteering with a state organization that develops childcare regulations. They'd heard about our case and invited me to join their safety committee. I attended monthly meetings where we reviewed proposed regulations and discussed implementation challenges. I pushed hard for stronger whistleblower protections and faster response requirements when facilities receive safety complaints. I used my experience to show why delayed responses hurt kids and why staff need legal protection to speak up. I realized I'd found my calling in early childhood safety advocacy. I could help shape policies that would protect kids across the entire state, not just at our facility. The work felt meaningful in a way that made all the pain and fear from the crisis feel worth it. A year after the arrest, I was leaving the grocery store when someone called my name. I turned around and saw the delivery driver who'd first noticed the saboteur near our delivery entrance. He looked older than I remembered, maybe just tired from work. He said he'd been following the news coverage and was glad he'd said something about seeing that woman. I told him his observation literally saved children's lives, that without his tip, we might never have checked the security footage. His eyes got watery, and he said he almost didn't mention it because he figured it wasn't his business. We talked for a few more minutes in the parking lot, and I thanked him again before we went our separate ways. That conversation stuck with me for days after, thinking about how one small decision to speak up changed everything. Several months later, I stood on stage at the State Child Care Association conference accepting a Safety Excellence Award for our facility. The plaque felt heavy in my hands, and I kept thinking about how weird it was to get recognized for doing what should have been standard all along. The audience clapped, and I saw Elena in the third row smiling with tears in her eyes because she knew exactly what we'd been through to get here. I gave a short speech about how crisis either destroys a place or forces it to become what it should have been from the start, and I meant every word. After the ceremony, 3 directors from other facilities came up asking how we built our incident response system, and I spent an hour explaining our protocols while thinking about those 3 weeks when we had no system at all. Driving back to work that afternoon, I realized the award mattered less than what it represented, that we'd actually changed something real. These days, I walk into the facility every morning genuinely happy to be there, which feels like a small miracle after everything that happened. I lead staff meetings where people feel safe speaking up about concerns, and I watch our new protocols work exactly how they're supposed to. Last week, a teacher noticed a child acting off and immediately flagged it. We investigated within an hour and found the kid just had an ear infection, but the system worked. Some families never came back, and I think about them regularly, wondering if those kids still have nightmares or trust issues because of what happened here. But the families who did return tell me they feel safer now than they did before. And the new families who chose us specifically because of our safety reputation remind me daily that the fight was worth it. I carry the weight of those lost families, and I probably always will. But I also carry the knowledge that I helped build something that actually protects children instead of just pretending to. The scars from that fight are permanent, but so is the change we created. And every afternoon when I watch kids play safely in the art room, I remember why speaking up mattered even when it felt impossible. And that's today's wrap-up. I like when stories carry something you can actually take with you. If this one did that, I'm glad you stuck around.